Hi everyone. And welcome to the first Bytes of Good Life of the year. If you don't already know, Bytes of Good Life, it's a monthly speaker series hosted by Hack for Impact, a student-run nonprofit with the goal of inspiring the next generation of technologists, designers, and humanitarians to develop software for social good. And today we have chapters across the country and even in Canada. Bytes of Good Life is an opportunity to engage in larger conversations on how to critically examine the roles that technology play in our society and explore potential career paths in the social good space. If you are interested in learning more, you can find all of our past talks and podcast episodes at bytesofgood.org. And today we are joined by Marisa Dinko from SEAM Social Labs, who will talk about her journey into the social impact space, empowering communities through data and civil tech opportunities at SEAM and beyond. We'll start off with introductions before going into a moderated Q&A. And afterwards, we'll open up for questions from you. So as always, feel free to send your questions in the chat throughout the event. And with that, I'll pass it on to Marisa to introduce herself.
Cool. Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Marisa. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a recent graduate from the University of Virginia. So I graduated this past spring. So for a lot of you that are in college, I am only slightly removed from where you are now. And currently, I'm working as a software engineer for SEAM Social Labs, and specifically our main product, CoCensus. So to give you a little bit of an idea of what SEAM Social Labs is, what CoCensus is, and how it relates to civic tech and public service, I think of SEAM Social Labs as kind of like Apple, and CoCensus is the iPhone. So CoCensus is our main product within our suite of products that we use to ultimately empower communities. That's our main goal, is to empower communities through technology. And CoCensus is a data analytics platform that specifically like government entities can use to conduct SMS surveys. We found that SMS surveys have been the most successful at reaching a wide array of individuals, especially because large proportions of people don't have access to internet. So SMS surveys are much more equitable when it comes to collecting data. So it's our main kind of method that we like to encourage at CoCensus. But then on the other side of things, we also work to kind of present data analytics for qualitative data to involve individuals, constituents, and diverse groups of people who often aren't heard or listened to when governments are making decisions in the process of understanding what it is that constituents want. So receiving feedback and then presenting it in a way through data visualizations, data analytics to these government clients in a way that they will actually be able to see what it is that these individuals are asking for and saying. So as a software engineer, I work predominantly on the side of things that has to do with making those data analytics features to go onto our dashboard for our clients. But we also have a host of other people who work very hard on creating equitable surveys, helping governments ask the right questions, and just guiding them through how it is to actually, or how they should actually be measuring what it is that they're looking to find out.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Marisa. Sort of to get into it, something that we do at Hack for Impact to ensure that we can be more reflective about social impact as a whole, as well as our varying experiences amongst our members, is actually have conversations about privilege and social impact as icebreakers. One of these icebreakers that I think we can maybe start with today for this discussion is, how were you first exposed to tech?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind for me with that is my first computer science class that I took in college was my second year of college. So I wasn't someone who like started coding when they were really young or anything like that. It was kind of a surprise to me that I ended up in tech. I was part of a program at UVA where we didn't have to take like core curriculum classes. So I didn't have to take STEM classes. So I basically did a deep dive my first year at UVA in like literature classes, humanities classes, and found myself feeling really overwhelmed with how much reading I had to do basically. And so I wanted to kind of expose myself to something new, flex a little bit of like the STEM side of my brain, and just take a break from all of the reading that I was doing. So I decided to take CS 1110, like the intro class, to learn a little bit of Python. And from the very first class, I really loved it. Like I remember leaving the first class and being like, I might want to do this. But I also remember the very first class feeling really challenged by it and kind of uncomfortable going into the classroom when there were very few women there, having kind of uncomfortable conversations with the guy sitting next to me, asking me why I was there, if I was a humanities major, things like that. So that's kind of the first like core memory I have of like being exposed to tech. But finding kind of my place in it took a little bit longer. And I think that's the case for a lot of people who are kind of entering into what can be an intimidating field for the first time. So for me, like the biggest game changer that happened to make tech not just something I was like trying out, but really like the crux of what I love to do, was getting involved with research during undergrad. And I feel like that's like a catchphrase you hear all the time of like, I'm going to do research, but what does that actually mean and how do you do it? I remember feeling like I had no idea how to navigate that. And so for me, that really looked like finding people who were doing good work and finding people who aligned with what it is that I was interested in. Like I've made it clear already, I've always loved the humanities. I love literature. I was also a global studies major. So there was a lot of other sides of my interests that I wanted to maintain throughout all of the computer science work that I was doing. And so for me, a lot of that looked like finding people in the computer science department who would even like take the time of day to consider connecting tech with the humanities. And just kind of barging into their office. I remember like I would send, my trick in undergrad was like sending emails, and then the next day I would go in their office and be like, I sent you an email, but I wasn't sure if you got it. So I just wanted to like check in. And I think that face-to-face like really helped me have the conversations I needed to have to get involved with the research that I wanted to do. And luckily for me, UVA had a couple portals online where you could see professors requesting certain things for research. And I found one that kind of had to do with the humanities. So I went in and talked to him, even though the project that I was interested in was a little bit unrelated. But a lot of times, if you take that first step to someone who has like an open mind to what it is you're interested in, you'll be able to kind of take the conversation in the direction that you want it to go. So it's kind of long-winded, but all that is to say, I think like when you're exploring tech, seeking out the people who are doing work that you want to be doing is a really like helpful tool, and not being afraid to like make those connections and, you know, knock on someone's door, or send them an email, whatever it might be, because a lot of times they were in the same spot as you and like wanting to find opportunities that might be less publicized. So all that being said, I can talk a little bit about what the research actually was that I got to work on in undergrad and how it kind of connected with my other passions and whatnot. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Perfect. Okay. So my research at the University of Virginia was specifically focused on natural language processing. So we were looking a lot at the student newspaper and how organizations were talked about at the University of Virginia. So I'll go into a little bit of context for why that issue was important in a second, but I want to start off with a land acknowledgement. Specifically, I want to begin by acknowledging that I conducted this research as a student on unceded Monacan and Manahoe Indigenous land in Charlottesville, Virginia. I also want to pay my deepest respects to the many Black enslaved laborers that built the university, and honor all of those whose lives, labor, and land was exploited for the development of the university. And I also acknowledge that I had a lot of privileges afforded to me as a white woman studying at the university that aided in completing this research and many of the other opportunities I've had. And that's really important also to acknowledge given the context of where I was doing my research and what it is that I was studying. So to understand a little bit about the University of Virginia, a couple quick facts is just that it is about 200 years old. It is founded in what was once the capital of the Confederacy by Thomas Jefferson, and it was built using slave labor. Given just that information alone, you can imagine how fraught and really dark the history is in a lot of ways. And not only when it comes to the history of slave labor, but also the continued racism and segregation that occurred throughout history. So there's that piece of the context of understanding what it is we're studying. But that also is kind of compounded by the fact that UVA functions with something called student self-governance. So at UVA, the student self-governance kind of motto and idea is that students are the leaders of the big decisions that happen at the university. And this started all the way back in 1842, I believe. So this is a very old ideal that has existed throughout a lot of the most fraught periods of time in history. And this isn't just students running their own clubs or things like that, but also students making really impactful decisions on people's lives, such as running the university judiciary committee that would, take case studies of students breaking code of conduct and make decisions about whether or not they would be expelled. So these are huge decisions that are in the hands of students in a political context that is not necessarily on equal footing. So all of that understood, when I was thinking about what it is that I wanted to study to kind of push forward and work towards more equity in history collection, I looked first towards the Cavalier Daily. The Cavalier Daily is our student newspaper at UVA. It's been around since 1890. And given the context of student self-governance, you can imagine the student newspaper is talking a lot about all of these decisions being made, the different clubs that are existing, so on and so forth. It is kind of very much like the hub for a lot of history and context at UVA. But even though it is one of the most historically rich sources of information about UVA's history, the only articles you can find online are from 1999 and up to now. And there's no main digitized database. It really hasn't been explored in ways that it should have been. And this is something I was really interested in and passionate about when I was at UVA. I worked a lot in the history circle at UVA. I worked on oral history projects and also was a historical tour guide. So this connected a lot of my humanities interests with a potential kind of spot I could take my NLP CS research. So with that, I decided to work with an advisor to study the student newspaper that I had access to and basically try and see if we could put data behind what students have been saying forever. And that is that the fact that student self-governance exists and that students, predominantly marginalized students, aren't being backed in an institutional way creates somewhat of a dangerous climate for them at the university as a whole. So I basically planned this out over the course of a year with my research advisor. So I worked on this my fourth year at UVA. And it was a lot to cram into 1 year. And I definitely think there's a lot of room for future exploration, but I wanted to kind of create a foundation to actually study what it is that people were saying. So the Cavalier Daily newspaper was online was very messy. It was on WordPress sites. It was on, a lot of different hosted websites. So part of the work involved just cleaning all of that up and pulling out the text and putting it into a database and trying to automate that. And we did so with roughly a 60% success rate and got about 14,000 articles to work with from 2000 to 2020. So we had a pretty good subset of articles that we could begin this work on to see if it was even worth cleaning up the rest of these articles to get more findings. So the main kind of techie things that I did in the research, first was named entity recognition, because UVA functions with student self-governance, student orgs and activists are at the forefront of change at UVA. So that's why I thought named entity recognition was a really important tool to use. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically trying to automate pulling out organizations, people, locations from a body of text. So I used a couple different tools to do that on all of these articles and store them in a database. So I would pull out and recognize Black Student Alliance, Queer Student Union, any type of organization, and then also the organizations that were mentioned in relation to it. So we could see the relationships that were actually forming between different students at different times. Next, because I was working with 14,000 articles and there wasn't really a very clear path to know where to start, I explored a bit of topic modeling. I used a program that basically you provided a number of potential topics and it would kind of categorize all of the articles into these different topics. And this really helped me not necessarily like have a clear answer of what it is that the topic was, but it gave me a direction of where I could look, what articles I should be reading to understand what was going on at the time. And then the main part of my research was sentiment analysis. So I did two types of sentiment analysis. One was a very broad sentiment analysis. It's kind of the classic thing that you hear when you think of sentiment analysis. It's a positive or negative score of a text as a whole to say if it's positive or negative. But then there's a more specific one called targeted sentiment analysis that you can actually say, look at this entity in this amount of text and tell me how people are talking about it. So that's what I worked on, was trying to say, okay, how are people talking about the Queer Student Union over time? Because this is an ever-changing issue at UVA. How are they talking about it over time, taking in context of the actual article? So I know that's like a lot of very technical information, and maybe some of you appreciated that and some of you were like, when is this going to end? That's okay. It's ending now. So some of the findings I got, one of the example findings I got from this research was actually about the Queer Student Union. So this is just one example of a visualization for fine-grained sentiment analysis. So this is targeted. It's looking at every mention of Queer Student Union or other names that that organization had and mapping out the sentiment over time. And while this isn't like clear-cut telling us something right off the bat, my goal was to really create a guide for people to be able to study this massive database of really like not touched articles of history. And this is a really great example because these dips that you see in 2006 and then the spike in 2013 relate directly to the historical and political context at UVA and beyond. So in 2006, you'll notice that dip. And when you're looking at the articles in 2006, one that stands out is called Intolerance Works Both Ways. And it was published during a UVA campaign called Gay Fine by Me, kind of in response to the campaign. Just a couple quotes to kind of give you an image of what this article was saying. One is, just as we should allow students to openly express their sexuality, so should we allow students to display their homophobia. Another, gays declaring that homophobia is unacceptable is tantamount to a Democrat saying that of a Republican or of a Christian saying so to a Muslim or Jew. Very clear negative sentiment that is reflected in the graph, but also that we might not have necessarily seen without this kind of like data directing us towards this point in history. And then in 2012, 2013, you notice that peak of highly positive sentiment. This is directly in line with political events locally and nationally. In 2012, multiple states in the United States legalized gay marriage. Specifically, the Virginia Senate passed legislation to protect LGBT individuals from discrimination in the workplace. And in 2013, Charlottesville hosted their first Pride. So there was a really big kind of like indication of this in history, but if you don't know all of the details of what was going on at every point in history, it's hard to know where to look. So ultimately, this research was to create kind of a guide for one day, I hope, administrators and people making big decisions at UVA to see that their students are actively affected by everything going on, especially given the history of the university. So that is the kind of technical piece of things of the research that I was involved in prior to graduation. I'll go ahead and stop sharing now.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's especially as someone who is also very interested in the humanities and how it intersects with computer science, and especially how we can apply that to social impact and social justice within our communities. I think it's super relevant for a lot of CS undergrads currently wanting to get involved in this sort of thing. So thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. To move a bit forward towards postgrad, with you working with SEAM Social Labs, what did the search for a social impact focused career look like for you, and what did that mean for you?
Yeah, so this was like a very big part of my fourth year at UVA, as it is for a lot of people looking for jobs post-grad, specifically because for me, summer after my third year during COVID, I did a remote internship for a bank, and it was not at all in line with what I wanted to do, where my passions lied. I worked in a bank, and I still can tell you basically nothing about finance. It's not at all like where my head's at. But it was one of those situations where at the end of my third year, I actually got pretty severely concussed and had a lot of issues in classes, and even just like there was no way I could apply for a bunch of other jobs. And then also this was an offer I already had going into a pandemic, and I couldn't necessarily afford to just not work at a place because I didn't really want to. So it was a situation that I kind of fell into, and it provided a lot of great experience and definitely expanded my skills technically. So it's not like it was a terrible experience or anything like that, but I felt really drained at the end of every single day. I felt like I wasn't really bringing my full self to work. I didn't really have relationships with the people I was working with, and to me, that's really important. And so I just kind of knew from that experience that like a huge corporation is not where I wanted to be. It's not something that would be fulfilling for me long term. And that was really difficult, especially in a university context where they're like, have you ever heard of Google, Facebook, and Microsoft? And they're kind of presenting them as like the big three places that you can work. And you see a lot of people, especially your senior year in the fall, you'll see a ton of people get jobs with huge corporations because that's when they do hiring for the most part. Whereas like organizations like SEAM and other smaller startups or just smaller companies, a lot of times their recruitment isn't even till the spring, closer to graduation. So there's kind of this like pressure, I feel like, to just apply for the corporate jobs because that's what you're supposed to do. And while I did thankfully, I had a job offer that I could fall back on with this bank that I was working for. I had to make a really big decision to keep applying for jobs. And I actually ended up backing out of an employment offer that I had accepted, which I don't generally recommend that you do. It's not like good practice. But I had to decide for myself that this was not something that was a healthy place for me to work because of my own personal ideals and things that I wanted out of my job. And that it was worth it to make what was a risky decision to do some really impactful work with a very cool company. So for me, a lot of that looked like deep dives into Google. I tell you, I clicked through so many links and buried and everywhere to find, smaller companies that were doing similar work to what I was interested in. And then looking at who was sponsoring them and who was supporting them, reaching out to people on LinkedIn. It's a lot of just classic surfing the web, really taking a deep dive to find these smaller companies that aren't advertised as heavily in places that they might tell you to look first, like a career center or something like that. So it is frustrating because some of the search can be on you, but I have found a couple of really phenomenal resources that I know will be shared at the end of this that hopefully can save you some time in that process if that's something you're interested in doing.
Thank you so much for those resources. Yeah, for everyone tuning in, we'll make sure to share all of that information to the Slack and everyone who RSVP'd. Also, as a side comment, if anyone has any questions during any point of this series or speaker event, feel free to post them in the chat now, and then we can bring them back up for the moderated Q&A, or the audience Q&A later on. But yeah, this is very relevant to a lot of the sort of conversations that we have of sort of balancing this idea of where we feel like we need to be working, or the pressure of our classmates and just the people around us, the tech industry as a whole, and what we're actually passionate about, what we actually want to make a difference doing. So thank you so much for sharing your story with that. It's very special. So when it comes to co-census, the actual project that you've been working on, what actually do you find valuable about working on something so impactful? And do you have any experiences or stories you'd like to share about, I don't know, a project or an aspect of one that you found exciting?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like first and foremost is just like the mission of CoCensus is to empower communities. And that's absolutely a mission I wanted to be a part of and that I've seen come to fruition since working here. Not just the way that we talk about data and have these goals for equity, but also in the way that we interact with clients and push them towards making decisions that consider the voices of people they might not typically be listening to. So I've loved learning from people on the team who, not just the other engineers, but also the people who, their passion project is designing the surveys and helping make sure the questions that are being asked are equitable, avoiding collecting unnecessary data like demographic data that isn't necessarily pertinent to the questions that governments are asking. So I think overall, just like the mission of CoCensus has been really inspiring to me. But also on a more personal level, I have loved the way that I've been able to kind of fuse creativity with engineering. That's something that I also thought a lot about in undergrad. I don't consider myself a super creative person. Like I'm not very artsy or anything like that. But when it comes to engineering, I think of it as kind of a creative outlet. And CoCensus and SEAM absolutely supports that. As an engineer, I feel like I've been able to be involved from start to finish of products and designing, and even how we're like framing things for clients. Every voice at the company is a voice that matters, even if it's not necessarily like your area of expertise, which I think is very special. And one of like the biggest examples I can think of was just a few weeks ago, we had some of our team works remote, but we had all of our team in person in the New York City office. And we had kind of like a brainstorming session for a couple of hours to talk about what our next big launch could be. And at first I was like, oh my God, like this is not my area of expertise. Like I'm not a super creative person, but we got split up into teams and just was given time to draw and draft up what it is that we might want to build in the next year or 2 years. And having the voice in that and then getting to pitch it and hear about other people's ideas and kind of meld them all together into one was so exciting to be a part of, knowing that, okay, next year I'm actually going to be coding and building these things. And then I'm actually going to see how it impacts clients. And then I'm actually going to see how that impacts the voices in the community. So I think CoCensus is really special because from start to finish, you're part of it and you're not just sharing your own ideas, but you're getting to hear from everyone else on the team.
Mm-hmm. Very special, yeah. Thank you so much. So for people who are interested in these same sort of, or similar sorts of environments in a workplace, do you have any advice to them in their job search for finding fulfilling social impact focused jobs or opportunities in tech?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, like it was really important that I figured out kind of my like deal breakers when it came to finding jobs, especially because I was looking to leave a job and find something different. It meant that I have to have a really clear idea of what that something different was. And while I didn't imagine like every single specific of that I've gotten out of CoCensus, I knew a little bit of like what it is that I was looking for. So for me, like it came down to even little things. Like I didn't want to have to take my piercings out when I went into a job interview. And I didn't want to have to feel like I, had to dress or act a certain way and I could just be myself. That was like a big deal breaker for me because I felt like my piercings had no influence on the work I was doing, and it was like the smallest thing that I could control in what can be a little bit of an overwhelming search. So whether it's something super small like that you do for yourself in the search to kind of like weed out people who you wouldn't want to talk to anyway, or it's something bigger, like I knew I wanted to code, and I knew I wanted it to be for like a bigger purpose than just building software. So looking specifically at organizations that had those kind of missions and just letting opportunities go that didn't align with that. And so even if you don't have every single thing figured out going into the search, if you can give yourself a couple, like, these are my things that I want post-grad or in my next opportunity, I think that can be really helpful.
Thank you so much. The advice is definitely very relevant and useful for a lot of our members, not just involved in Hack for Impact, but beyond, who are looking for these sorts of opportunities. So thank you so much. And just as a reminder, after this broadcast, we're going to be sending the resources that Marisa shared with us. And thank you so much again for that with you all. So yeah. So with that, that sort of concludes our moderated Q&A section. And now we can open it up for any audience questions as well. So if anyone has a chance, you can post your question within the chat on YouTube, and then we can present it here to Marisa. So we'll give you all a moment for that. But if I guess could begin with a question for my own, for people who are interested in getting involved in research and maybe have no idea where to start, what was the, or what advice would you give for a first step in that process?
Yeah. I think like a first step for me was like hearing about what other people were doing. So I didn't feel like I walked into any meeting having like a complete framework of what it is that I wanted to do, or what kind of, I honestly, for a long part of college, I was like, what is CS research? Like, what do you do? And a lot of those things, like, no one even bothers to tell you. So I think if you can make relationships with older students who are in your program of study, or, you know, doing things that you're interested in, a lot of times people who were in your shoes are absolutely like the best resource you can find, because they will already have connections that can be helpful as well. But other than that, I think a good first step is, you know, talking to professors or faculty, whatever kind of resources you have, and hearing about what it is that they're doing. And just like asking them point blank, like, I'm really interested in this. It doesn't have to be super specific. Like, I was like, I'm really interested in history. Is there any way we could connect history with the work that you're doing? Or is there any space for me to, you know, expand what you're doing into X field? Don't feel like you have to have the hyper specifics figured out. And also don't feel like every conversation has to like end in the perfect opportunity. It can just get you one step closer. And that's also really important, because it's a lot to take in and navigate, especially when you might be the first to do it and you don't know other people who have done it before you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you so much for that. Definitely useful for where we can go in terms of making an impact, especially on campus. So thank you. Great. Yeah, anyone has any questions, feel free to use the chat here. But otherwise, that's really all that we have today for this event. I can going once, going twice. We can give a little bit of time here. Okay. I guess with that, thank you so much, Marisa, for speaking with us today. I can bring back my Yuki on to close this out. Oh, we have a question here. Okay. From Michael. What are some considerations that you have to include when designing for consensus? Were there any surprising factors that your team came across and had to consciously keep in mind of?
Yeah. So I think some of the main considerations that we think about is how to best communicate the voices of the people that are answering these surveys to our clients. Because it's a lot of data, and a lot of these government workers don't have the time, energy, and aren't getting paid enough to look through every single response and draw all the conclusions on their own. And if we can make that simpler and easier for them and pull out the voices of the people and the key concepts that are being mentioned, and kind of uplift those voices, then it's better for them in the long run. So that's like one of our main considerations whenever we're designing for consensus. And I think something that surprised me a little bit, or not necessarily surprised me, just like I didn't necessarily think of before, is just balancing, designing a platform that we think works the best and what our vision is versus we have customers and we're a startup of 7 people and they might ask for specific things that we didn't think of before or we didn't think of as important, that we have to include in the platform or find a way to integrate. So it's a balancing act of, supporting what our clients want and building a platform that we're envisioning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Great. And we have another question here from Maya. What has been your favorite thing about working for SEAM?
Oh, this is a cute question. For me, it's mostly been like the team culture. I've really enjoyed it. It's been like a huge contrast from a lot of groups that I've been a part of when it comes to like coding projects and just like group efforts in general, especially like thinking about, corporate teams or anything like that. It is so much more diverse, not only in perspective, but also in, people's backgrounds, where they're coming from. And I feel like the experience of being able to like bring your whole self to the work, to the project, to say, I'm feeling X way today and like I might need to take a step back, or like I have this idea that kind of goes against what we were doing before, but I think can be really good, and feeling like you have the space to do those things has been really wonderful, and definitely one of my favorite parts of working here.
That's really beautiful to hear. Truly, like the work you all are doing and the culture that you're creating is, I really admire it, and it seems beautiful to work with. Cool. All right. If we don't have, okay, we have another question here from Wei. What is the importance of diversity in the tech world, and what does it personally mean to you?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That is like the biggest question, right? And like importance of diversity in the tech world means so much personally for every individual that even, feels like they can enter the tech world, but it also has like really reverberating impacts when it comes to the technology that's developed. I think about like bias in algorithms and tech that's being developed because, historically the people designing all of these things have been white cisgendered men. And so when you don't have these diverse perspectives designing like goods and services for the greater public, the goods and services are going to serve the people designing them the best. So there's that side of the issue that like could be a whole other talk, I'm sure. But I think personally for me, it has meant a lot of like grace for myself, which like I think, a lot of people who aren't white cisgendered men in the tech world can understand the feeling of like, do I belong here? Am I good enough to be here? Like you're harder on yourself than a lot of other people might be. And I think working in a diverse environment where, you don't feel isolated as like the only person of a certain identity or the only person coming from a certain background. You don't have those questions in your head as much of like, am I good enough to have X job? Or like, you feel like you have to work harder to prove yourself. A lot of that extra pressure that comes with working in a space so male dominated can kind of like fade off in the background. It's not to say that you'll like suddenly feel fine and everything is like rainbows and butterflies, but I think it creates an environment where you can like take a breath and actually do what it is that you're passionate about without those kind of pressures coming in as well.
Thank you so much for the answer. Definitely resonates with me personally as well, from being a minority within the tech space and how much diversity can mean to your experience within there. So Wow, thank you so much. Great. If we don't have any more questions, we can wrap up by bringing back Maniki and then we can close out. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Marisa, for speaking with us today. And thank you to everyone watching and attending. Our event will be hosting more speakers monthly, and if you simply can't wait until then, don't worry, because we also have Bites of Good Life podcast. And if you are interested in learning more, you can learn more at bitesofgood.org. And thank you all once again who came, and we can't wait to have you back again next month. And thank you so much, Marisa, for that wonderful talk.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I really admire the work that you all are doing and definitely wish I had some sort of resource like this in college. So really great work that you guys are doing.
Thanks, special. Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you.
Have a nice night, everyone.